Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Howard, and to our guests, thank you for being here. For Mike, Ambassador Froman, for coming back second year at this conference, and to the Minister for his long flight from Turkey, arriving just this morning. Thank you for the effort to it. I'm sure we all appreciate it. So we're going to ask a couple of questions, Ekim and I, and then we're going to do what's most important and throw it open to the audience for some questions. Minister, people are amazed at how well the market is doing, particularly after the events of July 15th. I was wondering if you could give us your thoughts on what the key reasons are for the resilience in the Turkish economy, given some pretty momentum happenings in your country.
Thank you, Jim. First of all, I'm delighted to be in Washington, delighted to be with great friends, and congratulations on 35th actually, meeting. Turkey has gone through a rough period. It's been tough. July 15th was probably was the final saga in this episode, at least we hope for. Market reaction to failed coup has been fairly measured, limited.
I think the microphone is not working with the Deputy Prime Minister. Let's have a stage for Mike.
She's working. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
There we go.
I think that's much better, yeah? Well, first of all, I'm delighted to be back in Washington, and it's great to be back with friends, and congratulations for putting together such a great Turkey-US conference. The answer to your question, Jim, is yes, market reaction has been fairly muted or measured. We've had a bit of knee-jerk reaction, but quickly it recovered. I think it's largely to do with the fact that we had reasonably strong fundamentals to begin with, even though there has been also some rough spots in Turkish economy. On the fiscal side, we've enjoyed a very strong balance sheet. Last year we had a balanced budget, a debt to GDP ratio that is roughly a quarter of OECD average, a third of Eurozone average, a banking sector that has been fairly healthy, well capitalized, strong asset quality, and growth that has been fairly resilient. The rough spot being current account deficit. I think that's one of the primary reasons. So the first reason is, to begin with, we've had decent fundamentals. But it wasn't probably the only factor. In the early stage, meaning in the immediate aftermath of the coup attempt, fears of political polarization, political tension, access to markets were probably overstated. And when it was shown that actually market access wasn't an issue, that the country was actually united, people from all walks of life, all sorts of political orientation, they were behind the government, has certainly helped. So there has been a significant political consolidation around the ruling party perspective on how to handle. Another reason possibly is, I think, we've been very open. On July 17th, I was on a conference call with roughly about 804 investors, explaining to them what has happened and what lies ahead. And immediately after introduction of the state of emergency, I was back on a conference call with around 1,000 investors. So I think, communication was also important. Final factor, we realized that that was a huge event, obviously, an extraordinary episode in Turkey. So we needed to respond in a positive fashion. And that the only way to restore confidence and limit market reaction was to introduce reforms. And that's exactly what has happened. In July, in August, there was a big push. We introduced auto-enrollment in private pension. This is a key reform in terms of boosting savings, reducing reliance on foreign savings, addressing current account deficit. We introduced reforms to enhance investment climate. I know there are a lot of question marks out there, but at least these efforts. And early this month, we pushed a major reform, a second generation reform, in terms of SME access to finance. And so the commitments to reforms not only were stated, but actually were proven. So I'll stop here. So it's a combination of decent fundamentals, political cohesion in terms of response to the coup attempt, good communication, and renewed focus on reforms. I think that was probably the best way of responding, and market has taken it fairly positively.
Thank you, Minister. Ekin?
Well, let me first say that we're absolutely delighted to have you here, sir. Thank you for joining us today. I'll ask the question that's on everybody's mind here. I have a lot of colleagues in the room who have asked this question a lot internally. So we're very happy we can get the answer directly from the horse's mouth, as they say. The United States and the EU have been pressing ahead with the TTIP.
That's not usually the part of the horse I'm compared to, so I'm delighted.
I have to plan my remarks better. So, as you know, you have been pressing ahead with TTIP negotiations, and many countries, like Turkey, have expressed concerns about how this would affect their economy and how they can be part of it. Of course, as you know, Turkey is unique in the sense that it is a customs union member, and we also believe that it's unique because of its position in the West and its efforts to that end within NATO and other reasons. So could you tell us a little bit how the United States will ensure that Turkey's interests are taken into account if a successful trade and investment partnership ends up being signed?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me back. It's an honor to be here with the Deputy Prime Minister. I learned, having been one of Jim Jones's deputies, that when a general asks you politely to show up, it's really meant more as an order. And so I always try to comply. Look, I think on TTIP, as you noted, Turkey has a special interest with regard to TTIP because of its customs union with the European Union. It's made itself very clear on that from its president and prime minister, deputy prime minister, icon minister, etc., for the last several years, and we recognize that as well. And so we set up a high-level committee between us to keep Turkey updated and briefed on the status of the negotiations. Our perspective has been that TTIP is complicated enough between the US and the EU that we need to remain focused on reaching an agreement between the two of us, but there will be countries like Turkey and others who have an understandable interest in it, and ultimately we want to make sure that we're proceeding in a way that takes those interests into account. I think obviously there have been a lot of developments in Europe over the last several months, culminating in the signing of their agreement with Canada over the weekend, and we think that's a very important and positive step forward. But we're going to continue to talk with the European Union about TTIP and continue to make progress where we can. Our goal is to try and deliver near-term results for our people as soon as possible, and to continue to make progress there. And as we do that, we'll keep Turkey very much updated on that progress, and ultimately, once it's completed, we'll be looking forward to engaging with Turkey and others about how best to interact with that with TTIP.
Thank you very much. I believe, General, I have the third question as well, with your permission. Deputy Prime Minister, you've explained that Turkey's macroeconomic fundamentals are strong. Most of the people in the room here are well informed analysts of Turkey's economy, so I think most of us agree with you. But there are some challenges with, such as lowered credit ratings, and there are some concerns about institutional independence. I know you're a strong advocate of institutional independence, so we'd like to hear your take on how Turkey and the government will address these concerns.
Well, thank you very much. What Turkey has gone through, of course, is extraordinary. And I think if you just focus on July 15, you won't get the full picture. I think you have to go back, probably 4 or 5 years and connect all the dots to understand what Turkey is going through. But the answer to your question, it doesn't matter what happens to you. What matters is how you respond. That's not my, by the way, statement. I think it's a Greek thinker back, 1700 years ago or something like that. My point is, I think our best response to enhance resilience is to step up reform implementation. And this is something we plan to do. So on the macro side, clearly, we have a good opportunity. As I said, there has been a significant political consolidation around President Erdogan and, of course, the ruling party. We want to make best use of this opportunity to reform. And there is plenty of reforms that have been in the pipeline at the Parliament, including an intellectual property law, industrial intellectual property law, a new tax reform, etc. Secondly, we do have fiscal space, and we are actually using that in the short term to support growth, because we know that it's a major shock to the economy. It's a temporary, but still a significant one. Thirdly, I think we also need to make sure that we remain open to trade. We are still strongly interested in enhancing a customs union deal with EU. We would like the EU deal, the new deal, to include services, agriculture, and public procurement, because we would like to be ready for TTIP. Ultimately, would like to be there. So that's really key. Right now, of course, protectionism is quite fashionable. I mean, there's been 1,400, essentially protectionist measures since the global financial crisis. We think that's the wrong way of addressing global challenges. And Turkey's challenges clearly is that we need to enhance trade integration regionally. So EU is #1 priority. We've recently tried to revive free trade agreement with GCC countries. So I think that may also be the case going forward. Our main sort of, let's say, weakness is essentially low savings and imbalances on the external side. You cannot address it through weaker currency. You cannot address it through protectionist measures. Unfortunately, there is that type of tendencies globally, but I don't think that's the right way forward. The right way forward is to go to root causes and address them. And that's where the savings reform come in. That's where reducing dependency on energy import is also another key area. It's something that we're strongly focused on local renewable resources. So that's, again, important. Finally, maintaining macroprudential framework is important, because macro-financial stability in the face of all these challenges has been maintained. I mean, there has been difficult circumstances, but generally speaking, we've had a fairly resilient economy. The type of shocks we experienced, just to put things in perspective, Eurozone debt crisis, we were affected we were affected the most, because EU is our key trading partner. Arab Spring turning into an Arab winter, a dark chapter, clearly what is happening in Syria and Iraq is having a significant impact on us, not through 3 million refugees, but also terror, etc. The problems with Russia, all of these domestic shocks, 4 elections in 2 years, a very violent, vicious coup attempt. So Turkey has gone through a lot, and we've proven to be fairly resilient. So the key, really, the magical word here is to continue to enhance that resilience, to do the right thing. And I'm convinced that we will remain on that path. I know there are question marks. I know some of the headlines have been poor. I can understand, but give us a little bit benefit of doubt. We will adhere democratic principles. We will ultimately strengthen rule of law. I know that doesn't sound, maybe doesn't come across, but the menace we're having to fight, a religious cult, a parallel state, a rogue state, it's not easy. Not easy to explain, it's not easy to handle. The loyalty, when you have loyalties of judges, prosecutors, some senior army officers, civil servants, that lies with a religious cleric that is behind the coup attempt. Turkey has no easy way of handling this. And so you have to put things in a context, but I'm convinced that ultimately Turkey will adhere democratic principles. Ultimately, we will come out of this, even though, as I said, some of the headlines today may not be very friendly. But we have no choice but to reform, to stay on course, to remain anchored to Europe, and we have a special relationship with the US, and it has been resilient. We have issues, but we want to make sure that that relation thrives rather than gets strained. And that's the primary reason why, I took the initiative to come here and be here, because I was just here, literally a month ago. And because we have a special relationship. And I felt that I needed to be here. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Ambassador Froman, one of the happy stories of the last decade is the significant amount of trade and investment between our two countries, and some very big companies operating in both markets. However, some people have pointed out, and I think our administration has said in some sectors, that we haven't even scratched the potential of the economic relations. So I was asking, based on your time in the White House and your wonderful service as our trade representative, what are some of the things that the United States government can think of to try to bring this potential to even a greater reality in the future?
Well, first of all, I think to put it in context, Turkey is an example of some very important economic successes.
Yep.
Unlike a lot of other countries around the world, it's grown and developed not completely reliant on commodities, but by investing in human capital, investing in its people, becoming more and more productive. It's a very attractive market in and of itself, and of course, it's situated very strategically between two critically important regions. I had the pleasure of taking my then, I think, 11-year-old son to Istanbul a couple years ago, and we were on a boat going up the Bosphorus and watching the shipping traffic going back and forth and up and down the Bosphorus. And he turned to me, because he teases me about my job, and he said, you know what, Dad, it really does all come down to trade, doesn't it? And no place exemplifies that more than Turkey. As you know, our trade relationship has grown. We've been trading $15 to $20 billion a year, more or less, over the last few years. It's grown about 20% since 2010, and yet there's a lot more that can be done. And we've got these various forums that have been set up to try and explore that. The President's Export Council, under the leadership of Secretary Penny Pritzker, took its first foreign trip ever to Turkey to explore with a number of CEOs, to explore what the opportunities are for expanding the relationship. And whether it's dealing with some of our long-standing issues like the enforcement of intellectual property rights, or opening up the government procurement system, making regulations more transparent and predictable, making sure, whether it's agriculture or other regulations, are based on science and the best international standards. These are all areas where I think we can do good work together, eliminate irritants, and also give an opportunity to highlight to the business community in both our countries what the real opportunities are. And the fact that this conference, tremendously successful conference, exists, and so many business groups back and forth have been created to bring people together, that will create a familiarity between our business organizations and create opportunities for increased investment too. As the Deputy Prime Minister said, there are questions at times about the investment environment, but what's important is that there be open ears and open mind to addressing issues as they arise so that we can continue to make progress and that Turkey continues to make progress on the path of reform that has been so important to its success to date and hopefully will open more doors in the future as well.
Thank you, Ambassador Froman. And ladies and gentlemen, now is a chance for you to ask your questions. So would you please wait for the microphone, and if you do have a question, please identify yourself and direct your question to either the Deputy Prime Minister or Ambassador Froman.
We have time actually for 3 questions, just to set the stage. With your permission, General, I would like to handle the logistics of it.
Okay.
Because I promised Anna, because she interviewed me, that she would get 1 question. So let's start with Anna.
Thank you. And the first is Deputy Prime Minister. Thank you for being here. My name is Anna Gold. I'm the Editor-in-Chief of Diplomatic Courier. And I have the first question for you. My question isn't directly economy related, but I believe it's relevant. I'd like to ask if there's any real proof that the Fethullah Gulen is behind the coup attempt.
Well, in our mind, there's absolutely no question. This is based on news report, but apparently we have supplied dossiers that include 500,000 pieces of information, testimonies, and evidence to our ally, United States, for ultimately extradition. But one thing that strikes me, I mean, let me just give you one anecdotal evidence that really provides strong clues. In the morning of the coup attempt, by early hours of the morning, it was clear that coup was failing. And so the military base that was used for staging the coup attempt, pushes were running. And a gentleman was arrested right outside of the fences. He turns out to be an associate professor of theology from one of the Turkish universities. And the prosecutor asked, why are you doing here in the midst of all this? And he says he was looking for property, he got lost. Anyway, he suggested the judge to detain him because he clearly is a suspicious character. But the judge goes ahead and releases him. It turns out that that gentleman, this associate professor of theology, had traveled to United States only 109 times on a salary of $1,500. But it's not enough. When Gulen made a call to save his bank, the FETÖ bank, they had a bank called Bank Asya. Back in early January 2014, he basically called on his followers to say, my dear followers, this is your bank, save it, if needed, borrow money, put it in the bank. There was a run on the bank by corporations, by individuals, because of course, they knew that the bank is owned by this movement. At the time when there was a run on the bank, he makes this call. Within 2 days, 97,000 new accounts have been opened. 5 billion lira has been deposited. 5 billion at that time is about $2 billion. And guess what? 5,000 academicians have deposited money, and one of them happens to be this gentleman. He deposited 4.1 million lira with his family into the bank in a failing bank. You wouldn't normally do it. For an associate professor in Turkey to make 4.1 million lira, I don't know how rich the family is, you need to really work hundreds of years and not consume anything. It turns out that there are also videos of him with Gulen. It turns out that from early ages he's been part of the network. It turns out that actually he has an office in the campus in Pennsylvania. I can go on and on, but the point I'm making is there are so many strong connections, strong evidence. We have absolutely no question on our minds. So there are many smoking guns that I could give examples of, but certainly this one is very simple, straightforward. there is very strong action.
Thank you, sir. So, any other questions? There's one there.
Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, I'm Catherine Floyd with the College of William and Mary. There are concerns about actions taken against Kurdish politicians and military operations in the Kurdish region. Can you please comment on this?
Well, thank you very much. Some of you may know, ethnically, I am a Kurd. I mean, I come from a fairly humble background. My parents were peasants, farmer, subsistence farming, and they couldn't speak a word in Turkish, and they were illiterate. Both my parents were illiterate because during their times in early Turkish Republic period, there were no schools in my village. So ethnically, I'm a Kurd. I learned Turkish at the age of 6 when I began my primary school education. Turkey has no quarrel with Kurds. In fact, if anything, Turkey clearly is stronger with the presence of Kurds in Turkey and in the region. There's absolutely no question. But we do have a problem with PKK. PKK is on U.S. terrorist list, is on UN terrorist list, is on EU terrorist list. U.S. has been a very close ally, and they recognize this. Now, in Turkey, over the last 15 years, under President Erdogan's sort of term or leadership, we've actually taken a lot of democratic steps in terms of boosting fundamental rights and freedoms, enhancing standards of democracy. And there was also a very strong effort for reconciliation. Sadly, partly maybe to do with what's happening in Syria and Iraq, but also partly to do with the nature of PKK. PKK is more interested in carving out a piece of land from Turkey rather than boosting fundamental rights and freedoms of Kurds and everybody else and coexistence, the way Europe exists. Europe today is made up of, at least as of today, 28 member states, hundreds of ethnic groups, hundreds of maybe different religious backgrounds. But Europe, is a great success story in terms of peaceful coexistence, tolerance, rule of law, fundamental rights and freedoms, etc. But sadly, PKK abused the current environment and is waging a very violent war against Turkey, and Kurds suffer. And there is a lot of evidence that municipalities in southeast part of Turkey are actually financing terrorism. So much of the action should be taken within that context. But ultimately, still Turkey wants to solve this problem through more democracy, more fundamental rights and freedoms. That's the only way. We cannot solve problems in the Middle East by creating new borders, new states along ethnic lines or along religious sectarian lines, because that would actually be formula for perpetual conflict. So the solution to Middle Eastern problem is actually more tolerance and more democracy and more stability and more prosperity. But sadly, this is not what we're getting right now. And of course here, I would like to call on my, of course, US friends that for us, PKK actually means an existential problem. And that applies to its subsidiary in Syria. Sadly, we disagree on this issue. But I really think that our US friends will come around ultimately that this is a big issue for Turkey, and this is poisoning, of course, the atmosphere. So we have no quarrel with Kurds. I'm a Kurd, but not only that, I genuinely believe that relative to, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, Turkey has gone a long way. We're not perfect. We still have more to do, so no question, but you cannot do more reforms at a time when PKK is waging a huge, violent, terrorist sort of activity against Turkey, is threatening Turkey's future. Clearly Turkey is responding to contain this, but we will move on, hopefully.
Thank you very much. At least there's a question there.
Yeah, this is
I
Patrick
hope it's
Anderson.
an easy one. These are all very difficult questions.
Yeah, I can't top the last two. So I'm actually hearing the Deputy Prime Minister again very comforted on Turkey policies. I'm concerned about U.S. policies, so let me ask our 17th Trade Representative. After some of the very unfortunate rhetoric of this election season, how are we going to talk after the election, without asking you to speculate on the outcome, about trade, including with countries like Turkey, given the rhetoric that's been spread around the United States, all of which is quite unfortunate?
That's the easy question. Well, listen, I, without commenting on the election itself, I'd say that, in fact, I'm comforted when I see polling that shows that the vast majority of the American public understands we live in a global economy, that we need to be engaged, that we need to show leadership, that with 95% of the world's consumers living outside the United States and 80% of the purchasing power outside the United States, if we want to make things and grow things here, we need to have access to markets abroad. So I'm confident that over time, that view will certainly make itself clear. I guess I'd also, and maybe I'm always looking for the silver lining here, but I think one of the positive things coming out of the debate we've seen over the last year is that there's a lot more attention being paid to the real and legitimate concerns that Americans have about wage stagnation, about income inequality, and about the kind of policies that need to be developed to address those issues. And whether it's training and transition programs or investment in infrastructure or the whole array of domestic policies, I'm hopeful that coming out of this political cycle, there'll be more bipartisan interest in moving forward with some elements of that agenda to address those quite legitimate concerns. You know our perspective, which is that we live in a global economy. We're actually producing more manufactured product. As of the first quarter of this year, we produce more manufactured product in this country than ever before in our history. For those who say we don't make things in the United States anymore, that's just empirically incorrect. We're doing so with fewer workers, and that's largely the result of automation. But you don't get to vote on automation. And you don't really get to vote on globalization, because that's a force. That's a factor of the containerization of shipping or the spread of broadband or any number of other factors. You get to vote on trade agreements. And so trade agreements become, in many respects, the scapegoat, the vessel that people pour their quite understandable and quite legitimate economic anxieties into. And we need to do a better job of addressing the root causes of those anxieties and then continue to show that leadership abroad.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. And let me just, on behalf of all of us, Deputy Prime Minister, thank you again for being here. You'll be with us a little bit longer till tomorrow, so hopefully we'll have a chance to talk some more on these very important issues. And for Mike, Ambassador Froman, may I just say, on behalf of all of us here, thank you for your service. Thank you for your extraordinary service to the nation for 8 years in the White House. And we hope that next year you'll come back and enjoy not being in the hot seat, but enjoy
having lunch.
The company, having lunch. So thank you all. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a round of applause.